Hi everyone, I found a box in an attic and it's full of old magazines from the First and the Second World Wars. I've got about 250 altogether, about 100 of a publication called The Great War, which was from the First World War, and I've got maybe 130 or possibly 150 of a publication called News Review that came out in the 1930s and the 1940s. It was actually about 5 years ago. I was helping to clear out my wife's parents' house because it had to be sold to pay for nursing home fees. And up in the attic, tucked right under the eaves, I found all these big bundles in a big cardboard box, all tied up with string. Now, the house in question, it was owned by my wife's parents, but before then it was owned by her grandparents. It was actually built in the 1930s by her grandfather, George. Now, George, we know he was born in 1892, and we know that he died in 1966, and we know that he fought in the First World War. So I'm guessing these are George's. And the thing I love about them is they're not history books, you know, they're not written by historians. It's not looking at things through the rearview mirror like a history book does. It really gives you a feel for what it was like to be alive at that time and to be reading the papers every morning and wondering what was going to happen and what was going on in the world. Now, whilst the First World War ones are kind of just very factual, kind of giving detailed descriptions of what different battalions are doing or how a particular battleship was built, the Second World War ones are not like that at all. It's far more like reading a modern day newspaper, albeit the journalistic style is very different. In fact, to be honest, it's the journalistic style that I've enjoyed most about these. They're full of funny little quirky things. Like, for example, I came across this cartoon, Adolf and his crazy gang, with a picture of Hitler playing a cello. Now, I don't know about you, but when I look at this, I kind of think they didn't get it, did they? It's almost as if they thought Hitler was some kind of comedy baddie or a pantomime villain. But, you know, I mean, this was 1939, so this is before the real horrors of the Second World War really became apparent. And then there are lots of shocking things as well. There are some accounts of anti-Semitism which really shocked me. Not so much because they were anti-Semitic, because of course we all knew that anti-Semitism was there, but it's the way that the British press reported it that I found really shocking, and I'll talk a bit more about that a little bit later on. So here we have the news review of August the 24th, 1939. So this is 6 days before war was declared. And on the front cover we have two foreign ministers, the German foreign minister Ribbentrop and the Hungarian foreign minister Karki. Now, if you've done your research, you'll know that Ribbentrop turned out to be a war criminal and he was executed for war crimes in 1946. So that's how history played out. But of course, here we are in 1939 and we've just got a meeting between two foreign ministers. So here on the letters page, some of these are quite funny. We've got one here, look, coal-driven cars. In the paragraph accompanying the photo of my paper's coal-driven car, which appeared in your issue of August the 10th, you state that it uses 11 pounds of anthracite per mile. Obviously, this is a typographical error, but as the statement may be harmful to the development of this principle of propulsion, and therefore to both our coal trade and our national defence considerations, would you kindly correct it? The car and commercial vehicles of similar weight, 2¼ tons, uses about 1 pound of anthracite per mile. That's Mr E.F.B. Corey. It'd be great to find Mr. Corey and bring him back to life just for one day and take him out in a Tesla. Great to see his face. And then we have Sex and Mr Gandhi. I am a regular reader of News Review. Your reviews are often sound and interesting, but I have found that where India is concerned, you are almost always not quite fair. You do not seem to understand India and her people. Either your knowledge about India is hopeless, or your correspondent in this country enjoys trying to belittle us. Your comments under the heading Gandhi's Pleasures in the News Review of the 29th of July are, to say the least, uncharitable because of the following facts. And then they list the facts, but number 3 is he never takes interest in sex, such as you say. Funny how you Westerners can distort things. A poor commentary on journalism at that end. And that's B.L. Purohit from Royal Exchange Place in Calcutta. And then the News Review says, News Review did not state that Mr Gandhi is interested in sex, as the reader says, but merely quoted from Mahatma Gandhi's own confessions. So the next section then is called Behind the Headlines, and this is really now getting to the meat of what's going on in the world this week. The key story of the week is that Germany has done a deal with Russia, and everybody seems to be really shocked by that because everyone was hoping, it seems, that Britain was going to do a deal with Russia. So it says, Britain was warned. British statesmen frankly admitted this week that the announcement of a German-Soviet pact negotiations was the biggest shock they have received since the Führer started carving up Europe. But it was only the suddenness of the announcement, not the actual fact, that jolted them. Foreign Office envoy Bill Strang, who spent several weeks in Russia trying to negotiate an Anglo-Soviet pact, repeatedly warned the government that Germany was trying its hardest to get there first. So the rest of this section then really kind of gives lots of detail and sets out more and more of the background to that position. But there's some interesting things to pick out. For example, it says here, Nazi-Soviet carve-up. In negotiations with Soviet Russia, Adolf Hitler had one objective in view, to realise Bismarck's formula of never fighting on two fronts against powerful enemies, a point which ex-Kaiser Wilhelm forgot. Germany's only foe on her eastern front is now Poland, which the Nazis are confident of smashing. So the point there then is that Hitler couldn't fight two wars, on both one to his east and one to his west, and if he wanted to fight a war with the West, he needed to do a deal with Russia. Which makes you kind of think, if that deal hadn't happened, maybe there wouldn't have been a Second World War. Who knows? Now this is interesting. It says that von Ribbentrop was the spiritual founder of the Anti-Comintern Pact. Now the Anti-Comintern Pact was a pact of Western nations that was designed to combat communism. So what it's basically saying here is that it says here von Ribbentrop had to eat a mountain of dirt when he flew to Moscow and did a deal with Russia. And it says Germany's internal weakness when confronted by the menace of war on two fronts is even greater than suspected by the democracies. British statesmen believe that only drastic necessity could force the Führer into destruction of the Anti-Comintern front. And by doing so, he has greatly damaged Nazi prestige in anti-red Spain and Japan. Because Spain and Japan, it's saying, are strongly anti-communist, and the Germans have upset them by doing a deal with Russia. Then this paper's blaming the Poles. It says Beck to blame. Though there can be no excuse for the steps taken by Russia at this juncture, much of the blame undoubtedly lies at the door of Colonel Joseph Beck, Poland's foreign minister. Ever since the rape of Prague last March, German policy has been clear, and the colonel is now being blamed for not having turned immediately to Russia instead of blocking the British talks with Stalin. It says here Neville Chamberlain is remaining calm. Apparently the only reason he ever even entered into negotiations with the Russians was because of pressure that he was under from the socialist opposition and the left-wing press. Apparently the Pope's going to get involved. It's been reported that Mussolini would receive an audience with Pope Pius XII at a villa near His Holiness's country residence in the Alban Hills. This is interesting. Germany's British friends. Matters are not helped by the letters which a number of misguided, titled persons in Britain write to Hitler and von Ribbentrop, asserting that Britain will not intervene in a Polish dispute. Such people assert that the chances of interference are now much less in view of the Russian surprise. The Germans, unfortunately, have all along been inclined to trust these know-alls rather than the British statesmen of high standing. So some aristocrats are basically writing to Hitler saying, don't worry, if you invade Poland, it'll be fine. Britain won't interfere. And then in the home section, there's an article titled The King. And it's commenting on the fact that the King has been spotted in Scotland. And it's commenting on the tartan that he's wearing, which is apparently a Balmoral tartan. Now, this is King George VI, who came to the throne following the abdication of his brother. And he's on the throne with his wife, Queen Elizabeth, who most of us came to know later as the Queen Mother. But this is 1939, she's the Queen, and the King and Queen have two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. And it's Margaret's 9th birthday, which is what's being covered in this in this article. But it's quite interesting the way they've written this, because this is what it says. It says, as the chances of the birth of a Duke of Cornwall becomes more and more remote, the position of the king's two daughters becomes more and more important. And then there's a footnote that explains that. And what it basically says is the Duke of Cornwall is the title that is routinely given to a future king on their birth. So what this is actually saying is it's looking less and less likely, isn't it, that our king and queen are going to produce a male heir, and therefore, shock horror, one of the girls might become queen. Oh dear, is kind of how I read that. And it says, though Princess Elizabeth has the major share of public attention, just as much importance is attached behind the scenes to the education and upbringing of Princess Margaret Rose. This 9-year-old girl, on whom tremendous responsibilities may devolve, is at present kept in ignorance of her position in the royal succession. So in other words, she hasn't been told that she's the second in line to the throne. I mean, I think that's quite funny. It makes me laugh. Just imagine the conversations in that house, can't you? Now then, Elizabeth, you can be queen, but don't tell your sister. It's quite funny how they write these articles. They have an almost journalistic style to them. I mean, this then goes on to say, early on her birthday morning this week, Princess Margaret was awakened by head nurse Mrs Wright, whose grey-haired and kindly presence she has known ever since she was born. She dressed herself in the rather small but sunny room which she occupies next door to Princess Elizabeth's room at Balmoral. She ran to the nursery and began opening her presents. It's kind of thing, was the journalist there then, were they? It then goes on to say, reports of royal birthday gifts are nearly always incorrect, for the greatest care is taken by the king and members of his family to keep entirely private what he rightly regards as private family matters. But among the 50-odd brown paper parcels that the princess unwrapped was one from Uncle David, the Duke of Windsor at Antibes. Auntie Wallis, who has never seen either of her nieces since she became their aunt, does not send separate presents, but has her birthday greetings sent by her husband. So this is the king that abdicated with Wallis Simpson living in the south of France. And she's never seen either of her nieces. And then in the cabinet section, there's an article about Lord Halifax, who is the Foreign Secretary. And again, it's kind of written a bit like a novel, the way it reads. It says, every Sunday afternoon at 5:15, there is evensong in the private chapel at Garraby, Yorkshire home of Viscount Halifax. Only the most pressing engagements will cause him to miss this weekly service, and at which he reads the lesson. The family chaplain preaches the sermon, and Garraby House guests and servants are expected to attend. High Churchman Halifax suddenly decided to travel to London last Saturday morning to prepare a long report on the international situation. He could not do it conscientiously at Garraby, where he was supposed to be taking a few days' rest, because all the necessary papers were not available. So he took a train from York to London and arrived at the Foreign Office in a taxicab, to the surprise of the most confidential members of his staff. All Saturday afternoon and part of the early evening the Foreign Secretary spent at his desk in the Foreign Office. He was alone in the vast buildings, save for secretaries and cleaners. Having done most of his report, he got up on Sunday morning and caught a train for Garraby. At 5:15, he went into the private chapel with his wife, guests and servants. After dinner, he stepped aboard a night train for London, then taxied to Eaton Square for a bath, a shave and breakfast before walking to the Foreign Office to begin one of the most critical weeks of his career. It's kind of like reading a novel, isn't it? And then the rest of this cabinet section is really speculating on whether war is going to break out or not. It says Viscount Halifax's job this week was to search for chunks in Adolf Hitler's armour. If the Führer wanted to climb down, he might have to be helped diplomatically. Well, there's a job. And then from Rome, reports that Mussolini might yet produce an 11th hour peace plan. Neville Chamberlain has returned to London at 7 o'clock in the morning after 14 days. Excellent fishing, bronzed and optimistic. There we go, Neville, optimistic again. So it's articles like this that really tickle me. Forests, more trees. It says, Ambling along the lanes of his rustic parish about 100 years ago, a Hampshire rector used to pull acorns from his pocket and sling them into the hedgerows as he passed. His son adopted the same habit but substituted apple pips. Those roads are today lined with oaks and apple trees. It's just a really nice image, that, isn't it? You know, a rector kind of wandering along, whistling probably, casually throwing acorns and apple trees into a field, and now we have lots of nice big trees. What a great idea. Then we've got this little section called Roundabout, which just gives little snippets of stories. The first one's quite interesting. There's this organisation called the Peace Pledge Union, and they've been broadcasting anti-conscription propaganda from an address off the Finchley Road in northwest London for the last fortnight. It says post office engineers using a new apparatus which is very secret and quite efficient have already sniffed their way to within half a mile or so of the illegal broadcasting station. So in other words, a pacifist group are broadcasting anti-conscription propaganda and the authorities are out to get them. The Air Ministry last year abolished the spin test, which was one of the tests that a pilot used to have to take to get their Class A licence. And the result of it being abolished has been a number of crashes due to pilots spinning and not knowing how to recover. I mean, one would imagine pilots have been dying as a result of that. And it just says, now the Air Ministry is being asked to reintroduce the spin test, which was abolished to make things easier for the Civil Air Guard. I mean, you can't help but think about how that would be reported in the modern press if that was happening, if pilots were dying because of a decision made to change the way they were trained. It'd be all over the front pages, wouldn't it? It'd be top news, there'd be a public inquiry, etc., etc. But back in 1939, it doesn't even make a headline. It's just a little paragraph at the back of the paper. And then it says, meteorologists have come to the conclusion that Britain will probably enjoy the brightest September and autumn in 4 years. I guess that's apart from the fact that the Second World War is about to break out. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that there are some quite shocking examples of anti-Semitism in this publication. Things which, if you are Jewish, or if you're a Holocaust survivor, or if you're descended from Holocaust survivors, I'm imagining you're probably going to find quite upsetting. And I've thought long and hard about whether to just take them out. I haven't done because I came to the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, that to do a review like this of this paper and then leave out all the contentious bits is, first of all, dishonest, and secondly, it's important to call out racism when it's found, and I feel there's a discussion to be had about how the British press reported this at the time, and what public opinion was really like in Britain at the time. So I've taken the view, rightly or wrongly, and I hope I've done the right thing, to include this next section. So this article is about anti-Semitism in Canada, of all places. And what it says is, bathing, canoeing, skiing and tobogganing are the diversions that draw Montreal's moneyed sportsmen to their lakeside shacks in the mountains. But holidaymakers awoke one morning last week to find that their favourite resort had taken to a new sport, Jew baiting. I mean, it's the trivial way that they report it. It's almost as if they think it's funny. It then goes on to talk about how daubed over Hebrew front doors were crude swastikas, hotels refused to take in Jewish guests, 200 telegraph poles and lampposts had been plastered with notices in French and English, Jews are not wanted here. This is in Canada. I mean, it just raises so many questions in my mind about what public opinion was really like in Britain at this time. And why did we fight the Second World War? Was it a crusade against the evils of Nazism? Or was it really only about self-preservation? And fear that the Germans were going to invade Britain? It's just so much food for thought. So it was at this point that I started to think, hang on a minute, is this some kind of far-right publication that I found tucked away in my wife's grandparents' attic? So I went on to ChatGPT and asked them, is the news review of the 1930s a politically biased paper. And what ChatGPT says is the News Review in 1939 had political leanings, though not in the overly partisan sense used today. Like most British newspapers of the time, it reflected the editorial outlook of the owners and the broader political climate. News Review, it says editorial stance. The magazine tended to reflect mainstream establishment viewpoints of the late 1930s Britain. That meant generally supportive of the national government, which was a Conservative-led coalition, mildly critical of extremes on both the left and the right. And in foreign affairs, it often echoed the cautious, sometimes conciliatory tone towards Germany that was common before the outbreak of World War II. Now, to me, that kind of sums up what I'm finding with this paper, a cautious but conciliatory tone to Germany. And there's a section here called Word Battle, which is basically about propaganda. And if I understand this correctly, I think what it's saying is that the Germans are sending mail shots across Britain. It says, through indiscriminate letterboxes came plain envelopes from Danzig, which is Gdansk in Poland. Puzzled recipients slit them open to find a card with a coloured map of the British Isles. Hull was pictured as another Gdansk, and an arrow-straight corridor ran west to the Lancashire coast. So basically then, the Germans are saying that if they conquer Britain, they're going to build the M62. And they're kind of mail-shotting everybody and trying to sell that idea. And there's a section here called Adolfiniums. So basically a student in America has been collecting a scrapbook full of quotes from senior Nazis and from Hitler himself. She calls them Nazi nuggets, and she says, pride of place is given to Goering's aphorism uttered at a foreign press conference. If what we have done here is lunacy, then lunacy becomes us. That's a quote from him. Everyone in Germany is a National Socialist. The few outside the party are either lunatics or idiots. That's a quote from Hitler. Oh gosh, here it says, the question of the divinity of Christ is ridiculous and inessential. A new authority has arisen as to what Christ and Christianity really are, Adolf Hitler. That's a church minister who said that. And Adolf is the real Holy Ghost. Scary. Gosh. There is no higher or finer privilege for a woman than that of sending her children to war. It's just shocking. Mickey Mouse is the most miserable idea ever revealed. Mickey Mouse is a young planned medicine to promote weakness. So basically what it's saying here is that Mickey Mouse is a plan to promote weakness and illness because mice spread disease, therefore encouraging children to watch cartoons about mice will encourage them to play with mice, I guess is the point. Very strange. And from here on in, the tone gets quite a lot more trivial. There's an article here, William Patrick Hitler. It says, William Patrick Hitler, who avowedly hates his uncle Adolf, but nevertheless resembles him, has been whiling away some time until the US autumn lecture season starts by writing a book about Germany. Among the Führer's likings, claims Willie, are cinema shows, carrying a whip, dancing girls and reading Edgar Wallace. Now, I googled William Patrick Hitler. He was born in Liverpool. He was born in Toxteth in Liverpool in 1911. And he moved back to Germany when his uncle came to power, but then fell out with his uncle and ended up in America and ended up joining the American Navy during the Second World War and actually fighting against Germany. And then he died in New York in 1986. And then in the theatre section, there's an article called Mighty Queer, and it starts by saying, the Southerner's idea of a typical Lancashire family runs to tripe-eaters who rattle their clogs along dreary cobbled streets, converse mainly in ease and buy gums, and go to football matches in red mufflers and read the Sporting Pink over kippers. This kind of caricature was last week put on the stage at the Duke of York Theatre in the thriller called Counterfeit. And then it goes on to say that the leading lady, the very lifelike lady, was played by a man in the form of Charles Hawtrey. Now, I guess most of us will remember Charles Hawtrey from the Carry On films, won't we? But in 1939 he was on at the Duke of York Theatre. So that was the news review from August the 24th, 1939. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you thought that was worthwhile. If you did, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot of these to go through, so if people are enjoying them, I'll keep doing them. Thank you very much.